Okay. Hello, everyone. I think that we are good to start now. I do have the chat open though, so if anybody, if anybody can't hear me, they don't hear me saying this. But if you're having any technical difficulties, please shout out, and we will deal with that. Oh, hi, Kimberly. Okay, great. People can hear. That's good. That's good. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I am speaking to you today from Canberra, Australia, which is the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I want to acknowledge that this land is colonially occupied. It has not yet been ceded. And I want to acknowledge the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, past, present, and emerging. So good morning from Canberra. We're at 6 a.m., bright and early. I've had plenty of coffee and I'm ready to go. I know some of you, it's even earlier, and some of you are have a nice, easy afternoon time. So thank you so much for coming wherever you are. I am Jenny Davis, and I'm a sociologist at the Australian National University. I am also the deputy lead on the Humanising Machine Intelligence Project here at ANU. Just really briefly, a little bit about me, not too much. But so I'm a sociologist, and I study the intersection of social psychology and critical technology studies. And what in particular I've been interested in is how social systems and technological systems intersect, and how social processes inform the materiality of the technologies that we build, which then, of course, shape us as individuals, social groups, and as a society as a whole. So we have 60 minutes together today. And so what I'll do is I'll speak for a little bit, and then I will have, So I just got a message that said, please start. So have I started? I think I've started. Yes. Okay. I've started. Okay. It must have been a delayed message. Thanks everyone. Who knows when these things begin? Okay. So there will be an activity component to what we're doing today, because this is a tutorial. So mentally prepare for that, but you'll have a little while of me speaking first before you have to do anything. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, if that's okay. Okay, well, okay, so just so everybody is aware of what's happening, I think if I go to slideshow, then I can no longer see the chat here. So I apologize if I just sort of run through something, but yeah, yes, other people had that trouble. Okay, thank you, Kim. Kim says she will monitor the chat. So all right, so I'm just going to jump into it, and hopefully somebody will yell at me if I need to stop for some reason. Okay. Okay, so the title of today's tutorial is Contesting Fairness in Machine Learning. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk about an issue that is directly relevant to this conference, and I think to many of the people in the room here today, and that's the imperative towards algorithmic fairness and fair machine learning. What I'll do is I'll start with some background about that, what we're talking about with algorithmic fairness and fair machine learning. I'll be pretty brief about that given the audience and the venue. I'll then speak about some critiques of fairness in machine learning and sort of this bigger question of, is this predominant standard that we've sort of generally ascribed to, is it the right one? And what might we need to either do that better or do something different? I'll suggest a positive proposal in the form of algorithmic reparations, which is based on some work that I've done. And then I'll put you all to work through a two-part short activity. One note that I want to make is that the content that I'm drawing on today comes from a targeted body of work, and which is also, of course, informed by a much deeper and broader body of work. But there is a targeted body of work that I'm drawing on directly as I go through the content today. For purposes of just sort of being smooth, I'm not going to go into kind of a deep literature review in the course of the tutorial. But instead, I'm going to kind of make some high-level points and some specific points with kind of haphazard reference to specific people and works. But then at the end, I do have a targeted reading list that will show sort of exactly who I was drawing on for the ideas that we speak about today. And I am happy, I'll sort of show that to you at the end, but I'm also happy to share that with anybody who's interested. Okay, so let's just, in this first section, I'm just going to talk about a little bit of the background in algorithmic fairness and machine learning, and how that's been operating in the field of sort of data and algorithm studies and computational sciences, as well as the pushback that that's beginning to receive. So what are algorithmic fairness and fair machine learning? The backstory of this, of course, is a very familiar one. Humans are biased, right? So we know this. We know we live in an unequal society and that people hold with them the cultural biases that they've learned as part of that social system, which means very often the decisions that we make are informed by a lens of inequality. And so to sort of ostensibly rectify this, there's been the introduction of algorithmic tools and machine learning tools that are supposed to help us make better decisions and to sort of offload some of these human fallacies that otherwise would pervade our modes of interaction and our allocation of resources, et cetera. However, of course, this hasn't worked out so great, right? So as we've automated things that were previously human tasks, what we've seen is the reproduction and in many cases, amplification of the biases and inequalities that they are meant to mitigate. And so from that has come the fields of algorithmic fairness and fair machine learning. Algorithmic fairness is sort of the broader umbrella category that refers to algorithmic systems and sort of big data systems that are geared towards rectifying those biases that have been built into technological systems and algorithmic systems. Fair machine learning is under that umbrella. It's a more specific application that refers to automated inference procedures over large data sets. Broadly, the kinds of biases and harms that algorithmic fairness initiatives and commitments, as well as fair machine learning initiatives and commitments, are meant to deal with are allocational or allocative and representational. So we're dealing with allocation, which is the distribution of good and bad things, right? How are things distributed? How are jobs distributed? How are criminal sentences distributed? For instance, how are loans, hiring decisions, et cetera? How are these goods and potentially harms allocated across different groups? And the goal is then to make those allocations fair. And the other element of that is representation. So how are people represented in the world? What are the symbolic meanings associated with different individuals and groups within a broader social structure? So this would be things like image processing and recognition. This would be the model of various human groups through targeted advertising, etc. So fairness is kind of a big deal, right? So there are a lot of different things that I could do, or metrics I could give you, or sources that I could point to sort of say, here's how big fairness is within the field of computational sciences and computational social sciences and algorithm studies and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I will tell you that I spent a lot of time thinking about sort of like what would be the best thing to do. Should I do a citation count? Should I, survey all of the books about this? Should I survey all of the, 20-something techniques that people have developed to deal with fairness standards, the different strategies, commitments, et cetera? But I think I always sort of go for local, right? So like what's most relevant to all of us right now is that we're at this huge conference all about fairness, accountability, and transparency. And even before it was fact, when it was fat, fairness was still at the front, right? So fairness has been really prominent within the community scholars that many of us here are embedded and that are sort of permeating public discourse. And of course, we see that in the title of this conference, but also if you were to look at the paper titles and the content that we're sort of discussing here in this venue right now, fairness, it's kind of a big deal. Or in other words, fairness is the predominant value that drives efforts towards good algorithms and good machine learning in that sort of moral, ethical, human, social sense. However, it's not quite working, right? So we see these immense efforts towards fair algorithmic systems and fair machine learning systems, and yet the inequalities that these systems are meant to mitigate and the inequalities that the adjustments to these systems are meant to mitigate keep reproducing themselves. And I won't get into sort of the specific examples because we know them, right? Like we all know them. And I think that's part of the problem is it's not just that these specialists can come in with our expert knowledge and say, hey, did you know that algorithms are biased, right? It's like so pervasive and so widespread that and everyone knows, lay people know, everyone knows this is a problem. And that's despite this, sort of our best thinkers, our best minds with the best tools trying to undermine that problem, trying to fix that problem. And yet we haven't. So what do we do about this, right? So just to kind of briefly recap what we've said so far is that there's this big field of algorithmic fairness and fair machine learning, and we're trying to undermine and rectify biases that permeate human interaction in social systems. However, what we've seen is that these efforts towards fairness tend to fail. So what do we do about that, right? We've got a lot of effort going towards this thing. It doesn't seem to be working so great. We're at this conference about it right now. What does it all mean? So there's been this sort of burgeoning body of work that has started to call into question the notion of fairness as the predominant value standard. Should this be the value standard to which we are committed, is what this work is asking. And when I say a burgeoning body of work, I really do mean it's new, right? So like these are the work that I'm drawing in particular here is stuff happening in the last 5 years or so, right? So we've, and of course, in this field, a lot of stuff that we're dealing with is new, but really this kind of critical mass of thinkers and scholars and social critics and commentators who are calling into question fairness as a value standard. It is a really new thing. And so what I've done is I've kind of gone through these pieces of work and I've been able to, though maybe others could do it better, so please when we have discussion time, tell me if I've missed something. But so I've been able to sort of distill what are the main critiques of fair machine learning and algorithmic fairness, homing in on the issue in particular of fair. So there's a lot of work, and I should distinguish this. There's a lot of work saying, here's how we do fair better, right? And that's technical work, and that's theoretical and conceptual work, and that's philosophical work. What I'm talking about here is the fundamental question about fairness as the value standard to which we should be striving. Right, so these are specific critiques of fair, not improving fairness within the existing scope of what we've sort of been doing. And so the main critiques are listed here. There's a presumed neutrality, right? This idea that we can ostensibly within fair machine learning get to a point where we're making some kind of objective decision. There's a flattening of demographic difference or an effort to erase race, class, gender, et cetera, in a way that sort of veers uncomfortably close or sits actually quite solidly within things like colorblind racism. It isolates and fixes identity in that it treats identities as mutually exclusive rather than intersectional and relational and evolving over time and across place. It's techno-solutionist in that it takes a social problem and keeps on trying to fix it with a technical element. There's an asymmetrical focus on disadvantage over privilege. That is, we think a lot in fair machine learning about harms, and we think a lot in fair machine learning about marginalization and minoritization, and that's fine. However, we think less about opportunity structures, who's at the top of those opportunity structures, right? So like, why are we talking a lot about Black womanhood, as we should, but much less about white masculinity? There's also an asymmetrical focus on allocation over representation. That is, how are goods and harms distributed, rather than how are we modeling and conveying the symbolic meaning of people and groups within the social world. And there's a dearth of marginalized and minoritized voices. Very often, especially in practice and in the field, what you end up seeing is sort of tokenized consultation rather than real sort of ground up leadership. And so we can put these into sort of two camps. And this is something I'm just sort of trying out here in this presentation. So again, feedback welcome. But so I think we can put these critiques in two camps of what I call fairness fallacies and fairness flaws. So fairness fallacies would be fundamental fallacies in the model of the world that fair machine learning and algorithmic fairness convey. So these would be presumed neutrality, a flattening of demographic difference, as though we can erase these race, class, gender axes that organize the social world, and an isolation of identities, as though each identity is mutually exclusive rather than constellations of social positions that make up compounding factors of advantage, disadvantage, privilege, power, etc. Fairness flaws are tied to the fallacies, but it's the things that happen in practice that undermine efforts towards mitigating inequality, or that end up reproducing inequality. And of course, I think a lot of these action items or these fairness flaws are rooted in this mismodeling of the world, or the fallacies that I have on the left side of the screen. And so these flaws are techno-solutionist, right? So we understand a technical fix to a social problem rather than as one component of a much broader effort. That's the focusing on disadvantage over privilege, allocation over representation, and this dearth of marginalized and minoritized voices. And I contend that if we fixed the fairness fallacies in the first place, then those flaws might sort of come out in the wash. Some of them, they would still take effort. So let's get into a quick example of fairness in action. And so what I'm going to do here is I sort of have a made-up example rooted in the context of hiring algorithms. The reason that I've selected hiring is for a few reasons. One, because it's a really prominent place that fairness is attempted to be instituted through automation and data-driven means. But also because I think hiring is the place that speaks to both allocation and representation, even though very often it's just thought of as an allocative task. Obviously, you're allocating jobs, so the allocation element of it is really clear, but also it's representational. When we think about the place of work in contemporary societies, it's tied very much into identity, community, and representations of value and status, right? So I was recently listening to a podcast, and a comedian on the podcast said, when you ask somebody what they do for a living, what you're really asking them is, how should I treat you? And I think that speaks to the representational element of hiring. And so I'm sort of anchoring the example here today, but then also in this example, but sort of other examples that I'll give in that domain, though I think it broadens. So the example of fairness in action, here's what this looks like, and here's where we would see some of those flaws and fallacies coming into play. The premise, as I said, is a hiring algorithm for a technology company. Let's call it Nozama wants to unbias its initial sorting process, making the selection more fair. So what does it do? So Nozama's top engineers build a machine learning model trained to ignore gender and race, right? So it's trying to achieve more neutrality. It's flattening demographic differences. It's isolating identity and treating them as stable and fixed categories, and ignoring marginalized voices, just drawing on existing top engineers, which we know from the data is probably a bunch of highly educated white guys, right? So then these guys, they make this algorithm and it sorts candidates and moves some of them to the next round, passing on others. It just sort of says, here's this technical solution. Thank you, machine learning model. And they do all of this with the aim to increase the number of job offers allocated to women and candidates of color, which is a focus just on sort of the allocative asymmetry, as well as the focus on disadvantage rather than attending to dimensions of power and privilege. So what do we do about this? How might we do this better, I guess is a better way to say it. So what I'm gonna talk a bit now about is this idea of algorithmic reparation as an alternative, right? So it's all sort of well and good to point to the problems, and I don't wanna undermine the value of pointing to the problems. I think, complaining is really powerful. Like, I think we have to often complain before we can move forward. And I'm a big complainer, I love it. So there has been this bubbling work about pointing out the problems of fairness, the trouble with fairness, as we just talked about. But now we're also starting to get to the point of positive proposals. What might we do about it? And so what I'll talk about here briefly is one such proposal that comes out of work that I've done with April Williams at University of Michigan and Michael Yang, who is a PhD student here at ANU and affiliated with the Humanising Machine Intelligence Project. And so we put forth this proposal called Algorithmic Reparation. And this is an alternative to fairness as the predominant value standard. And it's meant to be both a tool for auditing and building algorithmic and machine learning systems. The premise behind it is that we don't try to erase demographic difference. We don't try to flatten representation. What we try to do instead is attend to, address, and redress in particular systemic and historical patterns of privilege and inequality. We do this, the reparative approach comes from an intersection of critical race theory and in particular intersectionality that understands identity positions as multiple, socially situated, and contextually contingent, paired with political moves towards reparation or redress for structural historical differences in opportunity structure. And the idea is that we should not try to make everything even, but understand that we live in a fundamentally uneven, unequal society and course resources towards those on the margins. And to do so by treating the algorithmic system as one component part, maybe not even often not the central one, within a broader constellation of social, political, policy level adjustments. Critical and algorithmic reparation is that treating this as the standard not only could sort of help us potentially build better systems, but also attune us to make us sensitive to those systems that ought not be in operation, right? So it can also be a tool of dismantle. And as I've sort of said here on the left side of the screen, this is indebted to, informed by other sort of similar kinds of proposals that are sort of starting to come forth: algorithmic justice, decolonial AI, critical race theory for HCI, etc. So having explained algorithmic reparation a little bit is one thing, but then let's sort of go back now to that example that we had of the hiring algorithm. What would it look like to take a reparative approach, put in a reparative lens on that rather than one steeped in fairness? So the premise here is that a hiring algorithm for a technology company, again, Nozama, wants to make the workplace just, not fair, just, redressing systemic inequalities that now permeate their corporation and the sector at large, which, of course, is real life. So what would they do from a reparative standard? They would hire community activists, and note I said hire, not just consult, not just speak with. They would pay them as leads on their production team. This team helps identify the who, how, and what of both marginalization and privilege. The team builds resume sorting algorithms that mark against white masculinity and pair this with restructured family health, training, and payment policies that support groups identified as underrepresented. The Nozama team audits itself continuously and is audited continuously externally, determining if its job allocations, workplace culture, opportunity structure, etc., operate towards just ends, and how the hiring algorithm figures into this. If the technology does not work to disrupt and redress inequality, it's dismantled or continued not as a decision tool, right? And this has been sort of a proposal that's been out there, continued not as a decision tool, but as an indirect indicator of the deep-rooted problems the company sector and society must address. So one of the proposals that's been put forth in sort of this realm of critiquing fair machine learning is that sometimes when algorithms and machine learning systems can't address inequality, what it can do is render clear just how inequality is operating. So it can become a tool of information even when it's no longer viable as a tool of decision making. So what have been the responses to this, right? We've got this huge field of fair machine learning, very fancy people work in it, really widely read pieces of scholarship in books and articles live there as well. Now there's a sort of bubbling response to it. And as I've said, positive proposals. What I focus on is algorithmic reparation. How do people respond to that? Well, so there have been 3 responses, and I'm sort of depicting them here in correspondence with how with their actual size, right? So this does correspond to real size. So they embrace, resist, or ignore. So there's a sort of a small group who are taking these ideas seriously and saying, you know what, maybe fairness isn't the way, and maybe we ought to consider these other kinds of options and these other kinds of commitments and proposals that account for and attend to structural systemic inequality, not by doing fair better, but by pivoting away from fair. There's another group that kind of resists this for good reason. for good reason, given the momentum and inertia that fairness has in the field. And when I say resist, I don't necessarily mean people writing antagonistic hit pieces against the critique of fairness or impassioned defenses of fairness. But what I mean is formal and informal conversations in which these proposals are put forth, after which those who are part of those conversations continue going on trying to achieve fairness as though none of that happened. But the biggest thing that people have done so far is kind of ignore it. And again, this is to do, I think, generally with inertia, right? So objects in motion stay in motion. And so fairness has a lot of weight and a lot of momentum behind it. And a lot of people's, careers have been working towards this one sort of imperative. And so, yes, there's this bubbling critique, and yes, it is reaching something of a critical mass. And also that critical mass is still really small and nascent, and much bigger is the body of work that continues to operate towards fair. So this brings us to activity 1. And I'm going to do this. Okay, so, okay. So sorry, there's a quick question in the chat, I think, about what we mean by identity, isolation, and fixed. So before we get into the activity, I'll address that question really briefly, because that's a great question. So when we say that identities are isolated and fixed, that's in juxtaposition to an intersectional approach that identities are multiple and relational. And that's the idea that we all hold multiple identities. Each of those identities is associated with a degree of privilege and or disadvantage. So, and those don't come together additively, but holistically in ways that that patterns of power and privilege and patterns of marginalization compound. So for example, as I am a white woman, which means I occupy positions of privilege through whiteness, and potentially marginalization through patriarchal social systems, but my whiteness and my womanhood don't operate separately. They come together as part of something greater than the sum of its parts. And by saying we're treating identities as fixed, it's as though they operate the same way in all places at all times, when in fact, how identities operate will always be time and contextually contingent. It means something very different today to be a Black woman than it did 50 years ago. And it means something very different to be a Black woman in the context of computational sciences, for instance, than it does in sociology, where I do my work. And we can talk more about that. Oh, there's more questions in the Q&A tab. Oh, there's lots of them. Okay. So I think we're going to jump into that activity right now, and I'll look over these questions. And then when we come back, we can talk about them, if that's good. Okay, so activity 1, which I'll go back to sharing the screen for a second. Sorry. So activity 1, so I've just been spending the last, 35 minutes or so critiquing fairness, saying I think we can do better, and offering this sort of alternative proposal. But as I also just said, most people don't care. Most people have generally so far ignored that or resisted it in various capacities. And so I think one thing that's valuable is to kind of test the limits of this argument. And so what I want us to do in the first instance is for you all to sort of play the role of the super mainstreamy person in this community, right? So one of the resistors or one of the ignorers, and give the best argument for retaining fairness as an algorithmic and machine learning standard. We have this huge field of fair machine learning. We have this huge field of algorithmic fairness. Should we, right? And I want you first, in this instance, to try to answer, yes, we should. We should have this field of fair machine learning. We should have this field of algorithmic fairness. we should retain fair. And so what I'll do is I'll put this Google Doc link in the chat, and it's just a blank Google Doc. And what I'll do is, I don't think I can put people in breakout rooms. So what I'll do is I'll put this in the chat, and then no breakout rooms, that's fine. So what I'll do is I'll turn off my camera for the next 5 minutes, and we'll have quiet work time. So for the next 5 minutes, just play in that document, and play with the idea of, and you can, bounce off each other, et cetera, but just sort of jot down some notes about what is your best case for retaining fairness, especially given the state of the field and the size and scope of those efforts so far. So I'll start timing now, and then we'll all come back together. Okay, go. Okay, if everyone can hear me, I'm seeing things start to slow down in the Google Doc. It was a very robust session, and I really enjoyed reading pseudonyms as well as the ideas that you put forth. So let's go ahead and come back together now. And I will put this. What am I doing? Okay, actually, do you know what? Go back to that. Oh, that's better. Okay. So, so is there anybody who is willing to, actually, do you know what? Given timing, we're going to do a discussion at the very end. Okay, so that was really fun. And just to sort of summarize a few of the things that I saw coming out in there that I thought were some decent points were treating fairness as sort of like a lower bound. We're like, okay, well, we can do a lower bound and then we can sort of go from there towards reparative. So it's a baseline. Uh, there's a general sort of presumed understanding of what fairness is, and it's sort of a language that people understand and can work towards, which I think sort of one carry-on implication of that is when you're trying to convince a general public or funding bodies or technologists who aren't, sort of trained in critical studies and methods, that we ought to be implementing these efforts towards equality. Fairness is a piece of language that's going to help in that regard. The idea that fairness can be put into math more easily than can sort of a lot of the reparative standards that we've spoken about here. So yeah, so there's tons of interesting stuff in there. The next thing we're going to do is, and I'm going to slightly adapt on this on the fly. But so the next thing, the activity 2 is for us to, let me see if I can. So activity 2 is for us to argue against the thing that you just said. And so what I would, so what you just did is sort of argued against what I did the whole first part of the presentation, and you came up with some really interesting cases, some of them more viable than others, right? But so you came up with some really interesting points. So now what I want you to do is go back into the document, and I have here a different document, but actually what I want you to do is go back into the same document and just select a different color and argue with yourself. Whatever point you wrote in the last document, say the thing that's against that. And so sort of so that you have sort of a case on both sides, and feel free also to comment on other people's stuff, but you only have 5 minutes, so probably prioritize your own argument first. So what we'll do is we'll have quiet working time again for the next 5 minutes. And I want everyone to go back into the document and that we were just in, so it's the same one from the chat, and just select a different color and argue against yourself. And in this case, it's why ought we get rid of fair? Why should we instead move to reparative or other kind of standard? So yeah, so jump in there and I'll grab you in 5 minutes, and then we'll do sort of a culminating discussion for this last little bit. Okay, everyone. I see people are mostly finishing up in the doc, though there's still some notes coming through. Again, really fantastic work. I'm really, the arguments you're making on both sides are really interesting. And so what I would like to do now is invite people to volunteer to share kind of their arguments on both sides of it, but also to sort of speak generally about where we're landing. About where we're landing on this issue, right? So, given the conversation that we had, and given the arguments that you made, is there anyone who'd like to sort of share where they are now, if their mind has changed, or just generally kind of the case for and against FAIR as you see it based on this presentation, but also I'm sure based on some of the readings that you've done prior to today? And I'm not sure how to, is there like I don't know if there's a hand raise or if people just, can people like participate? I actually don't know the answer to that. Okay. Well, I think you might not be able to participate out loud. But we have a button to ask to share audio. Yes. Okay. Yeah, if you'd like to share, please do that. Yep, Michael?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So the way that first, thank you for bringing this to the community. The way that I've been thinking about it for the last 2 to 3 years, that's reflected in, I think, a little bit in my arguments, is that through the pedagogical lens of scaffolding. Like, even if fairness is not the goal, it's along with some of the arguments that it can be easier for people to grapple onto, that can be useful in from a terms of scaffolding to bring a community from where they currently are to being able to engage with more justice-oriented notions of the goals. And if there are ways where we can approach it where it's making things better than they were and not actively causing new harms, that scaffolding aspect can be useful in the long game of changing minds in order to be able to get people, possibly over several years or a decade, to be able to engage with more critical and radical conceptions of what we need to do with the technology. So that's just the way that I've been thinking about the relationship with fairness, and more reparative goals. If you've got thoughts on that or that particular framing, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, well, and I think that was actually, I saw some of that kind of coming through in a few comments in the Google Doc. And I think so correct me if I'm misconstruing this, but so my understanding is that there's this idea that if we create fairness as a scaffold, then that kind of becomes the baseline from which we can build and move towards something more reparative. But at first, we just have to kind of get some basic tools in place to start mitigating these harms as they're happening in real time. And I think that is I think that point comes from the right place, but I don't think it gets us to the right ends. And the reason I don't think it gets us to the right ends is because what we end up doing is entrenching a standard that traps itself, becomes a trap for itself. We end up entrenching a standard based on a fallacious model of the world that is meritocratic when in fact it's not, right? And so what we end up with is entrenching that neutrality and entrenching that mental model of what it means to be in the world as a meritocratic subject, when in fact there are historical and structural opportunity structures that will keep reproducing themselves and amplifying. And so what that ends up doing is building that momentum further. And so it creates a problematic base from which to build, in which we end up sort of reproducing the problems rather than alleviating them. Even if there might be sort of small benefits in the short term, that the long-term consequences, I think, would be not worth it. There's a question in the chat that asked if I could clarify the definition of intersectionality on if the definition of intersectionality on machine, yeah, thanks, Michael. That was a great point. If machine learning is complete or not, because it focuses on individual related attributes. It's not social related attributes. And what are the difference between macro level attributes and proxies? Shahthad, are you comfortable unmuting and kind of talking through that question a little bit? Or if, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't want to. I don't think I can answer that in the 2 minutes that we have other than, oh yeah, there you are, Shahthad, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm asking about the definition of intersectionality because the definition on computer science and machine learning only focus on individual related attribute like race, gender, but it's not include the macro level, which is the social related attributes. Like if there is such, for example, if a woman apply for a job and this job is a full-time, and then she's having a kids and with a full-time also husband, work husband. So there is another attribute which is related to social that can affect also the decision. This is called in social science as a macro level and micro level. Micro level individual related attribute, while macro level social related attributes. So is this like considered as a missing on the definition of intersectionality or not?
No, so intersectionality, yeah. So intersectionality, as I'm using it, is coming out of critical race theory, which is an amalgamation of the personal and the structural. So within the social sciences, when we're talking about intersectionality, we're talking about like Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hall Collins. We're talking about critical race theorists generally who understand micro and macro operating together through identity and through constellations of identity that become greater than the sum of their parts. And that's as opposed to isolated identities. You're just a woman, you're just a person of color, you're just the mother, et cetera. And an implicit understanding or explicit understanding actually of those individual micro traits and micro experiences informed by social institutions, policies, culture, and histories in which opportunity structures, culture, et cetera, have shaped what it means to be part of those multiple and compounding categories, such that your life comes to be not determined by, but shaped by a particular constellation of privilege and disadvantage.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And is there a difference between proxies and these macro level attributes? Because it's not like a direct effect to the decision or outcome.
Did you say, is there a difference between boxes?
Proxies and macro and these macro levels attribute.
Yeah, I would have to think more about that. Yes, I think so. I mean, I think part of the problem is that we say, oh, well, it's not just that we can get rid of race, class, and gender, but then also all these things become proxies for them. The reason they become proxies for them is because race, class, gender, et cetera, inform so deeply our social lives. And so there's sort of no way to have data that come from people and that have to do with people without those factors factoring in. And so those proxy variables are inevitable. And thus, which is why I would make the case that we need to approach with a reparative standard, because you'll never get rid of proxies. So we should sort of address and attend to them.
Yeah, that's clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think I'm already a minute over, so I just want to take 5 seconds and really quickly plug that there will be a workshop on algorithmic reparation coming up at the University of Michigan that I'm co-hosting with April Williams, who's there, with the call for papers coming out soon, and reading list, which I'm happy to share with anybody interested. Thank you all so much for coming. I thought nobody would come. I'm really excited. Really, really great conversation. Thank you so much, everybody.